Hello everybody, yeah, it's Warren here, back with another Total War Warhammer 2 tier list. And this was something I decided to push back a little bit after the patch dropped, because I wanted to see how factions would exactly be impacted and changed. But now that sort of things have stabilized a little bit after the patch, obviously there might still be a hot fix and whatnot, but now that things are relatively stable, I figured let's go back to where we left off, to the last requested faction, or the next requested faction on the list, and that was the Dark Elves. So this is a faction that honestly, well, didn't see much change in this last patch, and they've kind of been consistently good in power levels. They've ranged from being sort of decent to broke OP top tier in the wake of Queen and the Crone, to stabilizing once again at a more decent upper tier faction nowadays. Certainly with some of the nerfs to their most elite units, stacked on top of the introduction of factions such as Vampire Coast, which tends to counter them relatively well. Dark Elves have sort of seen some newer struggles appear, but still, in my opinion, remain a very competitive faction. Still easily remain one of the better balanced factions in the game, really. There's not many matchups that are really tough for the Dark Elves. There's not many matchups that are super one-sided in favor of the Dark Elves. And I think that's a mark of a good faction. But diving in, we're going to kick things off immediately with the head honcho, Malekith. And this is the one thing that I think Dark Elves do have a bit skewed in their favor, is Lords. And Malekith is an easy S tier, in my opinion. He's a decent combatant. He can fight okay. He's got decent melee stats on anything except his chariot. He's got a okay Lord of Magic. Lord of Dark is nothing to write home about, but at the same time it does have a decent amount of various utility spells. You've got Chill Wind, you've got Blade Wind, you've got the Word of Pain, and of course you do have Soul Stealer, which is really the huge selling point for Lore of Dark, that you can melt away your opponent's HP with some direct damage while at the same time healing your Lord. And this makes Malekith pretty nuts. Stacked on top of his innate tankiness, he can be an incredibly difficult nut to crack as he just spams these abilities on cooldown. Now, if he has a weakness, it's really his items, the Supreme Spell Shield, the Circlet of Iron. These items, they're just not that strong. Certainly he can increase opponent's cooldown by 15 seconds, but this isn't as potent as it used to be. It used to be 45 seconds, I believe, so it's taken a huge nerf there. And other items, they're just very expensive with what they provide, so if he has a weakness, it's that. But besides that, he's got great mount selection. If you want an AP horse-like mount, you do have the Cold One. If you want a great chariot, you can get a Cold One chariot. And if you want flight, you got a dragon, you got Seraphon. And Seraphon is no pushover. Gives Malekith some insane staying power, stack it on top of Soul Steal, just healing him constantly, and you've got a really brutal character. On top of that, he does have Stand Your Ground. He does have Gaze of Malice, which is a nice backline disruption spell and can mess up some squishier troops. And all in all, Malekith is a rather strong Lord choice. There's very little bad about him, except perhaps cost. He is a rather expensive Lord, and there's basically not a matchup where Malekith is an outright bad Lord choice. There are some where perhaps there's alternates that are better, or where he might not be the best choice, but I don't think there's really a match where Malekith would be a bad choice. And in that sense, he's arguably the best Lord for the Dark Elves out of all of them, because none of the other Dark Elf Lords can, I think, claim that sort of universality. Though there's certainly others that are very competitive, and that's actually what we're going to be moving on to number 2 here. Mom Morathi. Good old Malekith's mommy, taking care of her wonderful Darth Vader knockoff over here. She's honestly also a very competitive Lord choice. In my opinion, has a nicer selection of spells, having a mix of shadows, death, and dark magic. Dark magic, like I said, it's a decent lore, with Soul Stealer being the prime selling point. Morathi retains Soul Stealer, giving her that crazy healing potential. But on top of that, she gets items like Doom of Darkness. She gets abilities like Soul Blight, like Malekith's Miasma, abilities like that, which, in my opinion, are much more sort of useful in multiple situations. With Malekith, it's Soul Stealer that you spam, and I don't feel most of this other. You might bring a spell or two otherwise, but is really that's just have a little bit of extra utility, but Soul Stealer is really the bread and butter. With Morathi, there's much more shenanigans you can do with your spells. Unfortunately, she is much squishier than Malekith, despite Soul Stealer giving her some healing. She has basically no armor. She has relatively low resistances. She doesn't have a crazy monstrous mount. You can only put her up on Sulafet for Pegasus, which does give her crazy mobility, but it does not really grant her armor or much in the way of HP or survivability. Her melee stats are okay. She does have AP and anti-large, which is very solid. She can certainly goon out enemy lords, certainly crush squishier hybrid casters or squishier, especially caster lords, pretty effectively. Someone like Fanchantress or Gelt or Goblin Great Shaman or stuff like that, Morathi will kick the snot out of them pretty effectively. But against, she's certainly not able to go toe-to-toe with combat lords. One of her other great selling points is the variety of, well, she has great Winds of Magic generation with our Great Arcane Conduit, but more importantly, she has some stellar items and abilities. Wand of Kraydon gives her free Doombolt. Doombolt's not the most amazing spell, but honestly, if your opponent's not paying attention, it can do huge damage to a single entity, and if they are paying attention, you can still target, say, a unit of blobbed up infantry or cavalry, and it will do immense amounts of damage. Definitely much better than the lesser Doombolts on the Doomfire Warlocks, and she's definitely can be a pain, but that's not even the strongest part here. Between Enchanting Beauty and Heartrender and Darksword, she's able to generate a grand total of -18 melee attack and AoE around her when she's in combat, -9 melee defense as well, so she can absolutely cripple an enemy battle line, especially against factions like Vampire Counts, for example, who have terrible melee stats to begin with usually, so she can almost strip a lot of their units down to 0 melee attack or close to it, which is just insane and makes her very potent in such matchups. Those debuffs she has are just crazy. Definitely a very potent debuffing lord. She definitely has better items than Malekith, I think, but it is compensated somewhat in the sense that she's much squishier and ultimately less versatile lord. The squishiness and the fact that she's specialized against large makes her a little bit less of a good choice, I think, in some matchups. The lack of mount options also hurts, in my opinion. Following up on Mama Morathi, we do have Hellebron, or well, once she was Hellebron, now she's just Hellebron, and honestly, not a heavily used lord in my experience. Still has some potency, and for me, hovers between a B and a C tier. Hellebron's has some top tier combat stats. She's got AP no matter what the mount she chooses. She's got very high weapon strength on everything except her Cauldron of Blood, which does reduce the weapon strength quite a bit, but does provide her with various area buffs and makes her a chariot, essentially. But she does have a few problems. One, she's fairly expensive, and it gets more expensive with the fact that you have to bring caster alongside her. Two, she's very flimsy. There isn't a single mount option, really. Even the Cauldron of Blood isn't that tanky, and anything else is incredibly squishy. She tends to die very easily. She has no source of self-sustain. Certainly, she has some amazing abilities. Despite the nerfs, her blade item still drains away enemy HP pretty effectively. Her Murder Party is still an amazing AoE buff. Essentially comparable to something like Nikai's AoE buff, or a mini wall almost in a small area. So certainly not a bad ability, and she does have Heroic Killing Blow, gives her some insane damage output potentially. She definitely has a lot of potency, but the fact that she's so squishy makes her a bit unreliable, and when I say a bit, I mean quite a bit. Dark Elves obviously not the faction that's like most crippled if you lose leadership. It's not like Beastmen or something where you basically lose if you lose your lord, but and your opponent has terror or something on the field. But still, she is definitely flimsy. She is definitely rather snipeable. And the fact that you have to bring her alongside a caster, I think, hurts her quite a bit. Ultimately, you're generally going to be better off with other options, but due to her Murder Party, due to her monstrous melee stats, I definitely do think she has a bit of a niche. You can certainly run her in certain builds, get some stellar performance out of her. I think people don't play her as much anymore. I'd certainly say she's leaning towards C tier, but honestly, everything D and up here is going to be, and I'll say this before we get into too much detail here, but basically, if I rate it D or higher, the unit is not necessarily going to hamstring you if you know what you're doing. The build, you can make the units work in certain builds. I certainly think that Hellebron still has her niche uses. Next up, we do have Lokhir Fellheart, and he's going to make a B tier as well, and like I said, I'd say this guy, like I said for Hellebron, I'd say he's leaning towards C tier once more. He kind of dropped as a Meh Lord, and he's kind of remained a Meh Lord. His biggest gimmick really is the Dreaded Slaver perk, -4 leadership. You can stack that alongside, say, Charybdis, and then Doom and Darkness from a Deathcaster, and you can get some insane leadership bombs on your opponents. And you know, that's a cool gimmick. It's a fun gimmick, certainly. Lokhir is also relatively cheap if you bring him on foot. You can give him the Kraken Helm, which gives him healing in combat as well as extra melee defense. He also has the Duelist trait, or ability, which can give him extra melee attack and defense, 26 and 27, I believe. So some pretty insane buffage, self-buffage there. But ultimately, if you bring him on foot, Lokhir has the same limitations as Foot Lords. He's going to struggle to really get his hits in. If you put him on the dragon, you generally want to be cycle charging, and that doesn't synergize well with his item. The problem is that the regen only applies when you're in melee, and that just isn't great. It's not like Boris's item or Lewin's ability, where if you're out of combat, you're healing constantly passively. Lokhir has to be in combat to heal, and it's not like it's some crazy heal that he gets. It's still the same sort of heal that Boris or Lewin get. And in my opinion, that does restrict him a bit. It essentially makes him that tanky Lord option, where if you want a cheap budget Lord that can help you land a gimmicky terror out, Lokhir's your guy. But besides that, once again, not a caster. You have to combo him with a caster character, which is a limiting factor. Certainly you wouldn't rate him as a top tier Lord choice, but I think B, leaning towards C, is certainly a fair option, because he does have that certain versatility. Now, in my opinion, going on to our non-legendary lords, what I think is a stable B tier is the Dreadlord with Crossbow. The reason for that is that you can put this guy up on a Pegasus or a Dragon, and he can do some insane ship damage over the course of a game. He's very, very powerful in that sense. Still, he's limited by the same issues that plague Lokhir and Hellebron, in the sense that you have to bring caster alongside them, but you can bring him pretty cheap. He's got the Volley of Dark Arrows, which is a nice little magic missile attack, and give him some extra oomph. He can definitely chip away at enemy lords or units like Mortis Engines, force your opponent to deal with something you normally don't have to. Normally with Dark Elves, you don't have to worry about flying missiles, but between him and the Raven Heralds, you can certainly apply some major pressure to your opponents. And I think that's cool. I think that's a nifty way to play, and he's not a slouch in melee either. Sure, he doesn't have the shield like the sword and shield variant of the Dreadlord, but you throw him up on a dragon and he's still a beast. He's still very competitive, and definitely well-deserving, in my opinion, of B tier. Not up there in S tier or A tier with Malekith and Morathi and some of the other options for the Dark Elves, but just a very stable B, in my opinion. Definitely more stable, I would say, than Lokhir and Hellebron, who are very sort of one-trick ponies. He's also kind of one-trick. It's all about sitting in the air and sniping, but it's, in my opinion, a more universally applicable ability. Next up, we do have the Dreadlord with Sword and Board. She's unfortunately a D tier. I am sad to say her advantages over the Dreadlord with Crossbow are just not good enough to justify bringing her in almost any case. You get slightly better melee stats and you get a shield on most mounts compared to the Dreadlord. Then she does have some items, like an item that reduces enemy melee attack by 5. I believe it's called Dread Visage in her case, but the simple fact is it's not that good of a combo. If you would just want to fight, you have to bring a caster alongside her. If you just want decent fightiness, you can just bring a normal Dreadlord but a Dreadlord with a crossbow, or Lokhir for that matter. Honestly, Malekith is not a bad fighty lord, even though he's a caster and fighter all in one. Honestly, she just overlaps so much with a lot of these other fighting lords. She doesn't really provide any unique AoE buffs or debuffs that are sort of exceptional buffs and debuffs. And while maybe in a different faction she'd be a more appealing choice, in the faction where you have so many competitive lord choices, there's no way that the Dreadlord is really a solid option. She's just grossly overshadowed by all her peers here. And finally, the Supreme Sorceress, who's another easy S tier. And the reason for that is just cheapness and ability to spam spells. She's got great ability. She's got great lore selection. You got fire, you got beast, you got death, you got shadows, you got dark. You can spam spam spells pretty effectively. She's got great ones of magic generation. You can strip her down, and she's a dirt cheap lord option. You can put on a horse or a dark Pegasus. If you want some slight combat performance, you can even throw her on a dragon, and she's not terrible. And she does have the item called Undripple's Black Horror, which is a fun wind spell that can do a lot of damage to infantry. It's actually a very potent spell, and is one of the most gorgeously animated spells, in my opinion, in the game. But really, the main is just she's a cheap caster, and it's just like, for example, Gelt for Empire. He's not really special in any way, but you just spam spells and he's cheap. That is the same thing with Supreme Sorceress. She lets you go super wide. She spams spells and she's cheap. And there's nothing else you could really ask for, and it just makes her very strong. And it's a very simplistic explanation, but it's the explanation that applies. Next up, we do have our heroes. We're done with the lords, and we're on to the heroes. First of all, Knight Assassin. Now, this guy, for me, it's a tough one. I'm going to give him a C tier. And I know some people might disagree. Some people might think he rates higher. Knight Assassin has amazing item selection, in my opinion. One of, if not the best, item selections for a hero in the game. You've got a net that slows and does direct damage. You've got leadership debuffs. You've got enemy leader debuffs. You've got damage buffs to yourself in melee. He's got an amazing kit, but he sucks. And that's the overstatement. He doesn't suck. It's not that he's terrible, but honestly, the Knight Assassin costs, and now grand costs did go down and all that, so keep that in mind with this last patch. Some of the foot characters are a little more viable, but ultimately his range damage output is not that great. He's not super accurate with his hand bow. He's not sort of a great damage dealer against a lot of targets. He's got very short range, but unlike the Witch Hunter, you don't have AP missiles, so you're not necessarily churning out that crazy damage output. As Dark Elves, you usually want those AP missiles to shut down big enemy monsters, so you're probably, instead of bringing a Knight Assassin, you're probably going to invest in like Darkshards or Dark Riders with your crossbows, most likely. Shades, something like that. And the thing is, you don't really want the Assassin in melee either. He is very flimsy, and doesn't actually hold up that well in close quarters, in my experience. Ultimately, it's kind of like having a Waste Stalker with half the range and none of the perfect accuracy. And while yes, his items are good, his items are not good enough to carry him through that, in my opinion. So while he does have some situational uses, you can certainly use him in conjunction with the Goon Squad. He can certainly provide some valuable support, poison debuffs, that sort of thing. Don't underestimate him just because I say he's a C tier, but I think that he doesn't deserve to be higher up with some of these more versatile options that we're going to be seeing. On the flip side, the Death Hag I think is a B tier. Her Chill Blade alone, -5 melee attack in an area, especially stacked on Morathi, is nuts. But the Death Hag, besides that, you can throw her on a Cauldron of Blood, which lets you provide buffs to your nearby allies. Definitely very strong. You get a Chariot effect. If you put her on foot, she just mulches infantry on a budget. She's just a decent combatant. There's not much else to say for it, but you do get Chill Blade, which is just a nice debuff. Slows enemies, weakens their melee attack. She's good in combat, and you can put her, if you want, on a and granted, you don't see Cauldrons of Blood very often nowadays, but still, the Cauldron of Blood remains a relatively competitive mount option. It's just not as popular, I think, nowadays, but she can still provide some valuable support there. And in certain matchups, especially like vampire counts or something, you can completely cripple an enemy blind alongside someone like Morathi. Still not a universal character, certainly not someone you're going to bring in every matchup, but I think someone that you can bring in most. Or in a lot of matchups, at any rate. Next up, we do have the Vanilla Sorceress, and I'm actually going to give her an A tier. She's not an exceptionally good caster hero. I'm trying to think of what I consider like an exceptional caster hero. But granted, so it's kind of a very, very limited lineup, I guess. I guess I'm kind of harsh with the caster heroes in general. Honestly, someone that's exceptional for me as caster would be something like a Night Goblin Shaman. But either way, rather than segueing around, the Sorceress, she's cheap. She has mount options that give her mobility, which is all that you care for. She doesn't waste your money on stupid abilities that don't necessarily help you. Like, you don't care about melee stats on a character, on a caster, sorry. And she doesn't force you to pay for that, really, which is nice. She doesn't have crazy melee stats that you're paying for. The Darkstar Cloak is a nice extra Winds of Magic generation. She means you stack her on top, say, Morathi. I've actually run builds against vampire accounts, for example, where you have Firecaster, Morathi, and then Death Hag. It's a cool combo. And certainly she can generate those extra Winds of Magic. Very valuable. She's got... yeah, she's just a very cheap caster with a good selection of lores. And honestly, there's not much else that you could ask for in a caster. And that's actually one of the things that kind of helps all these combat lords stay higher up, is the fact that you don't have to bring a super expensive caster alongside them. In my opinion, it's a bit tougher for a faction like High Elves, for example, or Lizardmen, where you often have to pay a decent chunk of change to get your casters on the field. And so because of that, I do think the Sorceress deserves an A tier, even though maybe you wouldn't expect it based on sort of her raw performance. I do think that just low cost helps there, and certainly, yeah, it's just cost, and there isn't much else to say. And with that out of the way, we can move on to infantry. So first in the infantry category, we do have the Bleak Sword, and these guys, in my opinion, are B tier. And you're going to see a sort of common trend here with a lot of the Dark Elf stuff sitting here in sort of a mid category, in my opinion. But Bleak Swords, honestly, not the most amazing combat stats unless they've got Murderous Prowess procced. But they do give you silver shields. They do have some decent mobility, decent leadership for a lower tier chaff unit. They're not egregiously expensive at 450. Certainly, it is pricey for a chaff unit, but it's not other elf pricey. It's not dryad pricey. It's not high elf spear pricey. It's not eternal guard pricey. And that helps them. It means you can go a bit wider with your dark elf line. These guys could generate you some extra width. You can actually, if you give these guys chevrons with murderous prowess, they can become incredibly brutal murder machines. They can actually become pretty powerful in their own right. Depending on the matchup, you'll probably be running these guys instead of Dread Spears. There's certainly some matchups where you would run them. I think against, say, Empire, for example. It's nice just to have that extra width and ability to munch on Empire state troops. Oftentimes, Empire will go generate width with something crappy like Spears, and you can beat them down with Bleak Swords. But even against factions like Dwarves or whatever, you can use them to soak up missile pressure and just provide protection for your more valuable units. And I think that they deserve a B tier for that. Certainly not the most amazing sword unit, but, you know, good. Alongside them, Dread Spears, and the same reason. Cheap by elf standards for a chaff unit, silver shields, passable melee stats. The Murderous Prowess is a bit less useful on them because they don't have such good melee stats or offensive melee stats, but still they can hold okay. They do have those silver shields to soak up missiles. They just give you more width and more zoning, and just a nice combo. I really do like Dread Spears and Bleak Swords for just cost-efficient width. Obviously, that might not sound like exceptional or fancy, and it really isn't, but it's a valuable aspect to an army. And I think for that, they deserve a B tier. There's not going to be many builds where you don't run a Bleak Sword or a Dread Spear mix to back your lineup. Certainly, you're usually not going to mix and match these units. You're usually going to run one or the other, depending on what you expect your front line to do. But I think you will see both of them a good amount of time. Next up, Blackheart Corsairs, and I know some people are very not fond of these guys. I know some people would probably rate them down to as low as C or D tier. Personally, if this was purely on my... I try to give some sort of balanced view here. Personally, in my experience, I would rate these guys probably an A, because I love them, and there's very few builds, because I'm a very aggressive player. I love to rush with my Dark Elf builds, and Blackheart Corsairs synergize with that very nicely. So there's very few builds where I don't... Well, I say that, but there's maybe not the majority, but it might be the majority of my builds. I use Blackheart Corsairs in one form or another. But I'm very fond of this unit. But I do think that ultimately some of their weaknesses result in them being a B tier again. They have passable melee stats, not the most amazing. They've got 80 armor, and they do have... And this is the real sort of selling point, is the 80 armor plus 40 speed. They can blitz your opponent very, very quickly. They're a relatively cheap unit at 600. They can close the gap and slug it out with a lot of cheaper infantry in an efficient manner. You can use them to flank. You can bog your opponent down with more elite troops or cheaper chaff. So against Dawi, for example, you can tie them down with your cheaper troops or throw your Hargonite Executioners against their center elites. And in the meantime, your Black Hawk Corsairs can swing wide, and they can be running into the back line, and they've got 40 speed. They can trade into Slayers really well, stuff like that. Just a very potent rush unit. And 40 speed, that's really the biggest selling point with these guys. Now, there isn't anything else about them that's super exceptional, I think, but the 80 armor, their HP is very low. Their melee stats are not the greatest, especially without the bonus versus infantry, but 80 armor plus 40 speed is just such a great synergy, in my opinion, and puts them up to B tier. And they just synergize a lot with my rush heavy strats, so that's why I'm very fond of them. But I do think that low HP and the low melee stats can backfire sometimes and definitely drags them down a bit. That's why I'm going to rank them as B rather than A, which is probably what I would personally feel like they are, but I think a more balanced view is a B. Which does bring us on to Witch Elves. And these ladies are getting A tier, and some of you guys might be saying, why the hell isn't it an S tier? It's because the Sisters of the Singing Doom exist, and we're not there yet. But Witch Elves are insanely good. Granted, as many people don't realize, Rampage only procs when you've taken away an opponent's HP, or when you've taken away 25% of an enemy's HP. This can be by whatever unit. It doesn't necessarily have to be the unit applying Rampage, but it does mean that Witch Elves don't just randomly or automatically Rampage any unit they touch with their knives. They simply imbue the Rampage trait, and then if that unit loses 25% of its HP, it Rampages. But that said, the ability to Rampage heavy cav, or any cav, when it's trying to harass your backline is amazing. The ability to Rampage a monster and force it to fight halberds that normally monsters will just avoid. Normally something like Kolak or I don't know, a War Sphinx or whatever will just ignore a unit like Blackguard and just run away, and you can't do anything about it. Joke's on them. Scratch them with a Witch Elf, and they had less than 75% HP, and boom, they are now rampaging to their deaths among your Blackguard. And it applies in many other ways. If you can snare, if you can get Witch Elves into backline, they snare some archers, they will butcher the archers because archers won't run away. Your opponent can't run away. If they snare undead units, they're incredibly powerful because undead units don't rout even, so you can't even hope that they run away after they get beaten down hard enough. Light cav gets demolished. They can get snared, dragged into spears. Prevent your opponent from disengaging from bad engagements. They're a pretty mobile unit at 44 speed. Their raw combat stats are not that great. They'll lose to a unit like War Dancers or something pretty handily, but that's not really what you bring them for. They're such a great utility unit. And honestly, if Sisters of the Singing Doom didn't exist to be picked basically every time when you take a Witch Elf unit, and then occasionally you bring Witch Elves to supplement Sisters of the Singing Doom, I would rate these ladies as an S tier because you'd always bring Witch Elves, but because the Sisters of the Singing Doom exist, these guys are stuck at A. Next up, we do have the Sisters of Slaughter, and these ladies are also going to get an A, definitely leaning towards S tier. Stellar sustained combat stats. They will outtrade most, if not all, infantry. Actually, not all, obviously, but most infantry in a straight-up engagement, including many great weapons and many units you wouldn't expect them to outtrade. They'll outtrade units like Black Orcs. They'll outtrade units like, I believe they'll outtrade Bestigors. They'll outtrade, if I remember correctly, even Plague Monk Censer Bearers, who have a really decent matchup with them because they get magic and a huge charge bonus. But despite that, because of their high sustained melee stats, they've got poison. Keep in mind, they've got poison, so they debuff enemy weapon strength by 20%. Then they get another 20% from physical resist. They've got a 20% shield save with their bucklers. They've got very high mobility. They've got Trial of Blades, which boosts their melee attack and weapon strength when they're losing in combat. Just all in all, they're a stellar unit. Their biggest weakness is ranged and cavalry. Cavalry dumpsters them because their HP is very low and their armor is non-existent, and so they get mulched by heavy cav. And a ranged fire will horribly destroy them. It's really quite brutal what a unit like Pistoliers or Grenade Launchers, Outriders, or whatever can do to these ladies. But if they get into combat, I think they're stellar. I don't think there's many matchups where they're a bad choice. Even against factions with high armor units, Sisters of Slaughter can perform exceedingly well because of those crazy sustained combat stats. And for that, I think they deserve an A, if not S tier. For me, it's almost leaning towards S, but we'll give them the benefit of the doubt here, put them at A. Next up, Executioners, and these guys are definitely the other end of the spectrum. I would put them down as C. I think in many ways they've been supplanted by the Sisters. Fact is, yes, they are tankier against, say, cavalry. They can blitz enemy infantry more effectively than Sisters because they'll do more damage quickly. They're a much quicker damage dealer. But they are slow to move around. Their HP pool is still nothing amazing. They don't have all these damage mitigating effects like Sister of Slaughter do, so you don't have physical resist, you don't have poison. They don't have a shield save, so AP missiles wreck them. They cost 1,200 gold, which is kind of expensive. I'd say these guys might actually be overpriced for what they do. Certainly they have niches where they can butcher heavy infantry, and I certainly don't think they're a bad unit, but I think C tier is probably fair. They're definitely a niche unit in the Dark Elf roster. I think that where Witch Elves are near ubiquitous, or more accurately, Sisters Sing Dumar, Sisters are a very common pick. Blake Swords, Red Spears, and Corsairs are very common. Executioners are something you see rarely, and if you see them, you'll usually see first and foremost the Blades of the Blood Queen, who I think are much better, in fact, than they are. Just being an expensive great weapon. And the other thing is that one of the biggest threats, like we discussed earlier, the threat of enemy heavy cav against your Sisters, it's actually something Dark Elves don't have that much issues with, because they can zone with either Dread Spears, or they can zone with their Cold One cav, which is very cost effective, or they can harass Dark Rider Repeaters, that sort of thing. Your opponent often won't get those charges into your Sisters, so it's worth keeping in mind. Next up we do have Blackguard, and I think these guys are going to get a B tier because they're just such a stable anchor. In raw combat performance, they're actually pretty terrible in my testing. Certainly Dark Elves tend to struggle a bit in testing because they don't get Murderous Prowess, but despite that, Blackguard doesn't trade particularly well into a lot of infantry. Well, you don't necessarily expect it with a halberd. Most halberds trade okay, whether Chosen Halberds or Temple Guard or whatever. Blackguard does not. They're no Phoenix Guard, but they compensate for it with their insane holding potential. They're immune to psychology. They have 90 leadership. They have 100 armor. Decent HP pool for an elf, though nothing insane, certainly. Decent melee defense. They're functionally unbreakable in most cases. Like, they'll rout when they've got like 6 models left, unless your opponent focuses on their leadership super heavily, which most people will not bother doing. And because of that, yeah. The Blackguard is a stupid strong anchor, and it's what keeps it at B tier. Because in actual combat performance, I don't think it's that good of a unit. It's actually pretty meh. But his staying power and holding potential is insane, and that's really why it deserves this spot, in my opinion. Because of that one specific point. Now moving on to Regiments of Renown. We do have our Hellebron, if I can find them. Here we go. The Regiment of Renown Spears. These guys are hovering A to B tier. I'd probably end up putting them at B, because you're not going to bring Hellebron every time you bring Spears. The reason being that while they are pretty strong and they get poison, they also cost a lot more. They cost 250 more than Dread Spears, which is a hefty price increase on a relatively expensive roster. Like, sure, Dark Elves are not expensive by Elf standards or elite faction standards, but they're expensive they're still definitely one of the more expensive factions out there, and oftentimes there's better ways to invest your gold than an extra 250 into Spear unit with poison. It's definitely great utility. It can definitely help you control backline for sure, so don't get me wrong. They're still a very popular pick, but I don't think they're popular to the point that they supplant Dread Spears. As opposed to the next unit, the Sisters of Sing Doom, which are an easy S tier, because if you're going to bring Witch Elves, you're going to bring Sisters. And they're just Witch Elves on the crack. They have fear, they have terror, and they have level 9 stats. And that's all there is to say. There isn't much else to say, but having an easy access to fear and terror is very nice. It means you can break an enemy line quickly. Of course, you still have the Witch Elf benefits of being able to rampage enemies. You can still you can mulch lower tier troops much more effectively with this, because they've got better combat stats. So all in all, Sisters of Sing Doom, very powerful combatant. There's very few builds where you won't see these ladies, just because Dark Elves will traditionally bring in a Witch Elf to get Carl's Rampage, and the Witch Elf they're going to choose is going to be Sisters of Sing Doom, and they're just better than Witch Elves, and they only cost 250 more. So And it's funny because I literally just said 250 more is enough to undercut the Hellebron, but the thing is, keep in mind, it's over a 50%, it's like a 60% increase in cost from basic spears, whereas in this case, it's like 30% increase in cost to get some arguably more significant improvements with the Sisters of Seeing Doom. The fear, the terror, the extra stats, the fact they just don't route, which elves can be routed. Sisters of Seeing Doom will basically fight to the last lady, so definitely nifty and very potent unit. And the Hargoneth Executioner, Regiment of Renown, the execution, the Blades of the Blood Queen, A tier in my opinion. I say A tier, maybe it's actually B tier, because to be honest, Hargoneth Executioners are definitely a bit of a niche unit. But if you're going to bring Executioners, you are going to bring these guys. They are very strong. They certainly cost a lot more than normal Executioners, but the extra frenzy is a huge buff. Their stats are just much better. They will mulch enemy infantry for days. It's like the Crimson Killers or something. Their potential compared to the vanilla unit is just insane, and it's a big boost. Now, you don't bring Executioners in every matchup. They're a very expensive infantry unit. Certainly, they're not something you bring every time, but there are certainly matchups where they can be game changers, where they can just mulch your opponent and turn an entire tide. Against Dawi, if you get these guys into combat without getting mulched by range fire, they will win you a game, potentially. They're just that powerful. They don't route, essentially. They're insane. I love them. I think they are a stellar unit in their function, and that is why they get a B tier here. Now, besides that, we do have our missile play, and so going into missiles, we're going to start with Darkshards, and we're actually going to knock these out quickly, both at the same time, because I believe both units are C tier, and this might come as a surprise. The unit is obviously very strong in the campaign, and on paper, it looks like an insanely strong unit. Certainly, the combat stats are nothing crazy, but compared to something like, say, handguns, and the DPS is better. Their range is not really any worse. They're more mobile. They've got better leadership. Comparable survivability. The shielded variant has silver shields on a missile unit. So on paper, and only costs 675. So on paper, they don't look bad, but in practice, they just don't really, in my opinion, deliver. For a few reasons. Part of the problem is that Dark Elves are not the best at defending backlines. They're better than a lot of other elves. Don't get me wrong. Because, like we discussed, something like, say, Dread Spears are cheaper than other elf spears. And they do have the cost-effective Cold One Knights to provide backline defense. But it's not a foolproof defense, and a single unit can sweep these guys aside. They do not have good innate combat sets of their own. If they get caught in combat by a unit, say, Reichsguard, or even Skirmish Cav, these guys will go down. There's, in many ways, they're like normal state troop crossbows or something, or state troop missile units, really, because they'll just go down really easily in combat. Second of all, though, is their functional performance. Their burst is not crazy good at only only 23 damage off the top of my head at every 10 seconds. So their burst isn't insane. They've got low projectile velocity, relatively speaking, that being a crossbow unit rather than a gun unit. This is a huge disadvantage compared to, say, Empire handguns that isn't immediately visible based on the raw stats, but the fact that you cannot reliably hit, say, air targets, or the fact that your opponent can actually juke around with monsters and whatnot, or wonky animations will make monsters dodge out of the way a lot of the time, is a killer for this unit. And stack this on top of the fact that Dark Elves don't have any snares. They can't just force a unit to stay in place, and the Darkshards' ability to dish out the hurt suddenly becomes a problem. So you're in backlines, you don't have 300 gold Empire Spears. You've got Dread Spears, which cost 450. You get 2 Dread Spears for every 3 Empire Spears. You don't have the projectile velocity. You don't have the survivability in close quarters. You get compromised by anything, even dogs, and you're screwed. And plus, most Dark Elf builds, due to the short-range nature of the Dark Elf roster, are usually pretty aggressive. These guys are not necessarily the most aggressive unit. They're more of a standoffish unit. In my experience, you don't necessarily want them getting too close to the fighting. Or oftentimes you'll find with Dark Elves that you're better off just swarming your opponent's backline, shutting down their backline rather than relying on your missiles to do a lot of damage. And for that point defense to deal with big monsters or specific targets, you've got Shades and especially Dark Riders with bigger crossbows, which fulfill that role in a much more competitive fashion. Now, next up, we do have Blackheart Corsairs with handbows. These guys, for me, hovering between B and A tier, they can get incredibly abusive in a handful of matchups, which is why I'm going to give them a B. I think A is pushing it a bit. I don't think they're quite A tier. But a very mobile unit, once again, they've got 40 armor, or sorry, 40 speed, 80 armor, just like their cousins with the dual wielding. They can fire on the move. They can do decent amounts of non-AP damage. They can fight okay in melee. Against certain factions, they can be stellar. Against factions like Beastmen, they can really do insane amounts of work, and then move in for cleanup in Isle 9 once their opponent is whittled down. They can melt units like Minotaurs or low armored monsters. Even higher armored monsters with some support from magic or debuffs they can do rather well with. And yeah, in my opinion, they are an easy B tier. The mobility and 365 is just very, very nifty for sure. Now, besides that, we do have Shades, and these guys come in 3 varieties. And interestingly enough, they're going to be scaling in 3 different tiers here. So Vanilla Shades over here with the single sword. These guys are, in my opinion, a B tier. And there's a lot of B tier for the Dark Elves, but honestly, it's just that these units are very niche. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's actually good in my opinion. There's so many niche units that you run in certain matchups, but you don't run in every matchup, or you don't run in most matchups. And I actually think that's a strength. I think that's a good thing to see. But regardless, Shades, if you need to shut down big monsters quickly, Shades will do the trick. If you need to sneak up on enemies, unload some volleys, these guys will do the trick. They're great against factions like they're great against factions such as, to an extent, Dwarves, Lizardmen, Vampire Coast. I know Turin especially is very fond of them against Vampire Coast. They can mop up cheap chaff. If your opponent tries to send dogs after them, or even light cav, they'll beat the crap out of them. Something like Skinks, they'll clean up pretty effectively. They can, as the game draws to a close, they can do cleanup. If your opponent gets heavy cav on Shades, Shades won't just roll over and run away immediately, because they have decent enough melee stats to hold. They won't win against, say, Reiksguard, but they'll hold, and that's really all you want. Now, dual-wielding Shades, they're another story. They are a D tier, in my opinion. The reason being is that if they cost quite a bit more than normal Shades, and the benefit you gain is better melee stats, but ultimately, you don't really bring Shades for their melee prowess. You want to get off your ammo, and these guys have no improvement to being able to dump ammo. They're just a little bit better at cleaning up small targets. Which sure isn't terrible if you happen to have like a couple points and you literally have nothing else, like no chevrons or something to put them on. Okay, maybe it's worth it. But really, in most cases, these guys, you don't care for the extra bonus versus infantry. It doesn't help you against a lot of cav or backline harass that normally would threaten you. And it won't help you against a lot of even heavier infantry, really, but very, very much. And at the same time, it just cranks up the cost of an already expensive missile unit. So in my opinion, this puts them at D tier. There's not really many situations where I consider them a decent choice. I just don't think they're a terrible unit. It's just their benefits aren't good enough. Maybe if they got certain tweaks to be a really good infantry mulcher, maybe they'd be worth. But I don't think so in their current state. Now, Shades with Great Swords, I think are C tier. I think they belong in between here. The Great Swords give them potential to mulch heavily armored infantry. In close quarters, especially if they've weakened them beforehand with missile play. I do believe these guys can put like a volley into Empire Greatswords and then win a straight up fight, if I remember correctly, which I tested. So that's pretty insane for what's a dedicated missile unit, essentially, for what's a very powerful missile unit. They've got insane, of course, damage output. They can even trade well into heavy cav because of that monstrous weapon strength and AP damage. Just a very, very good unit, but very expensive. And that's what holds them back. That's what keeps them at C tier. But I think the AP damage is good, is situationally very good. And I think that is what will put them at a C tier for me. It definitely puts them above the dual wielders who just don't offer good enough benefits compared to normal one-handers to be worth it. And that does leave us with the Regiment of Renown Crossbows, if I can find them. The Regiment of Renown Darkshards, also C tier in my opinion. To be honest, I'm not even sure they should be here. Not necessarily maybe D. I'll give them a C. They do have extra range compared to normal Darkshards, which is nice. They have the Shield Breaker trait, which is on paper amazing with so much massed AP fire. But in practice, having to defend a near 1,000 gold ranged unit to get value out of that, and the range isn't that long. Usually you're just not going to invest in these guys. Occasionally you will bring them with a Dark Elf firing line, and that's why I think they are C tier. You will see them sometimes, and I think they can be used. And their perks are not bad, but they're combat they suffer for many of the same reasons as normal Darkshards. They're just expensive to defend. They can't really fight their way out of a wet paper bag, despite the level 9 stats on them. They still suffer most of the same downsides of normal Darkshards. They just cost more. Yeah, they're not bad, but still, they cost almost 1,000 gold. It's pretty nuts. And in that situation, you're often better off taking the more survivable shades and accepting the fact that you just won't do as much damage against shielded targets necessarily. And that kind of holds these guys back, in my opinion. Now, from there on out, we can move. I guess we can do artillery, because there's only one artillery piece. The artillery piece, the Reaper Bolt Thrower, is, in my opinion, C and hovering towards D tier for the Dark Elves. It's definitely the worst of the two Elf Bolt Throwers, by far. Having 30 less range than its High Elf cousin is a really big issue for this unit. It just cannot... So the High Elf Bolt Thrower isn't the greatest counter battery piece to begin with. It loses to Empire and Dwarf Cannons in a 1v1 in most situations. It is outranged by them by 60 meters to begin with. And this only gets... it gets worse. It gets exacerbated with the Dark Elf Reaper. The Reaper Bolt Thrower only has 350 range. It gets outranged by Great Cannons by 100 meters rather than just 70. It gets, which is huge when you need to push an artillery piece through another 30 meters of space. That's a big disadvantage. It's a big downside to engage enemy artillery pieces. So unless your opponent is really dumb on a small map, like Crossroads or something, and gives you their artillery into a duel position, the Bolt Thrower is often going to fail. That said, it did get buffed recently. Its Bolt Thrower shot, Scatter Shot is definitely better. It still has a niche against factions that don't have artillery of their own or don't have great counter battery artillery. Honestly, against a faction such as Vampire Coast, it's actually not that terrible of a unit, because Carronades are just so terrible in counter battery fire, unless your opponent tries to use Spiteful Shot. So certainly they can work. Certainly it's not a terrible unit. But it's certainly a very niche unit. Much like Darkshards, you'll only occasionally bring. You'll only occasionally bring Shades with Great Swords. You'll only occasionally bring Executioners. You'll occasionally bring a Bolt Thrower to harass your opponent, to force them to come to you, to shoot back against a Way Watchers. Situations like that. That's why it gets a C tier. From there on out, I guess we could do Missile Cab, because it's a small category and there's, once again, not much to cover here. Dark Riders with Superior Crossbows, easy A tier, bordering on S even. If you're going to bring a missile unit for the Dark Elves, it's probably these bad boys. High mobility, decent AP damage. You don't have to babysit them a ton. Where normal Darkshards cost a mere 50 less, or in the case of Shields, they actually cost 25 more than these guys. Sure, they have more damage output, but they require so much more protection and so much more babysitting than a unit that has 92 speed and can just escape from every bad situation. It's an advantage they have over even something like Outriders. Outriders can get caught by a certain heavy cab if it hits their charge animation. Dark Riders, I believe, are fast enough to escape that at 92 speed, and they can certainly sort of outrun a lot of lighter cav as well. Something like Wild Riders, for example, can't reliably catch Dark Riders. Units like that definitely won't get an easy pickings there. And yeah, just being able to provide sustained AP damage against units like Mortis Engines, against units like against units like Mortis Engines, or single enemy monsters, dinosaurs, single entities, that sort of thing. It makes this a very valuable unit. As Regiment around Brother, this is a unit I struggle to place because it's an interesting unit. On one hand, it is very flimsy. If it gets shot, it dies. If it gets hit by magic, like say Tempest, it dies a horrible death. But at the same time, the Raven Heralds are very nippy. They do have some crazy damage output in a relatively bursty situation. They can melt enemy units like Mortis Engines, or once again, they can melt those single entities with little fear of reprisal. They can really augment that Dreadlord with Crossbow. And they often, the mere fact that this unit exists can force opponents to adjust their playstyle, or adjust their strategy, or adjust their build to try to deal with them. Yeah, they're not necessarily a universal unit that you'll always bring, but I think especially against factions like say Beastmen, where your opponent doesn't have the greatest anti-air, the fact that you force them to invest in anti-air to deal with this potential unit can be a big win. Dark Elves can invest in some limited Air Force. They don't have to over-invest in Air Force, but you can bring like a dragon or something, or a Lord on a dragon, or Morathi on a Sulafed or something to zone away cheap trash flyers that could harass you. And then the Raven Heralds can do the rest. They can do some insane work from on high, and it forces out certain picks by factions, like especially shorter range factions, or factions that don't necessarily have best counterplay, like Vampire Counts or Beastmen or factions like that. And I think that's why they deserve a B tier. And with that, we are on to Cavalry. First and foremost, I suppose we do have Dark Riders, and these guys are honestly not a great light calf, but I would give them an A tier. And that's because there are very few Dark Elf builds that do not involve a lot of Dark Riders as a zoning tool. Dark Elves, like we mentioned before, do not have the greatest range on a lot of their missile play, whether they're artillery or their infantry shooting, or even their cavalry shooting. This means that they're generally forced to rush, they're forced to play aggressive, and means that the unit they tend to rely on to counter enemy skirmish play is generally the Dark Rider. Just to disrupt backlines to harry enemy troops. It can provide some very good staying power. It's definitely A, leaning towards B tier, but there's very few builds from the Dark Elves where you won't see Dark Riders used, at least in some capacity, to disrupt backlines. Depending on how much money you have left sitting around or whatever, you might see them used with or without shields. But while not being a stellar unit necessarily stat-wise, and kind of having the wasted potential of murderous prowess, because generally you won't get the benefit of that before the unit dies, they are just so important for disrupting backlines and preventing your opponent from getting huge amounts of value out of their shooting. And because of that, they make an A tier, even though perhaps you wouldn't expect it, or I wouldn't personally say they're an A tier unit just by raw stats, but their mandatory nature almost, I think, makes them an A tier. Which does lead us on to Cold One units. So Cold One Knights, easy S tier in my opinion. They are just such a cost-effective beast. They, with proper support, whether from Doomfire Warlocks, Slaanesh Harvesters, or a Lord, they can demolish enemy heavy cav with basically any price point, provided they get the right support. They've got decent combat stats. They've got decent sustained combat stats. Primal Instincts used to be a significant limiter on their capacity to perform well, but Primal Instincts has been changed to the point that it's practically irrelevant. By the time it procs, this unit's basically dead anyway, so who cares? And yeah, they just trade super well into enemy heavy cav. They can do an okay job against infantry. They got AP, good weapon strength. Just an all-around great unit for only 1,000 gold. They are definitely one of the better units out there for any faction. They cause fear. They got decent they've got decent combat stats. Their only real downside is low HP pool. They've only got 4320, which is terrible for a heavy cav. It's actually lower than a lot of light cav. And in fact, it's, I think, the lowest for any heavy cav in the game, which is kind of sad. And it's definitely one of the limiting factors on them, that they can lose their HP very quickly. They can lose models to Spirit Leech pretty quickly. That hurts. Next up, Cold One Chariot, another A tier in my opinion. Dark Elf cav, definitely strong. Cold One Chariot went from being a trash tier chariot back when Primal Instincts worked the way it did because it rampaged at 50% HP, to now, once again, Rampage is basically irrelevant. By the time you Rampage, you're basically dead. So, Cold One Chariot, it's cheap, only costs 1,000 gold, it has a missile attack, so it applies the under missile fire debuff to enemy leadership. It does some good damage. It's got AP, weapon strength. Not the greatest charge bonus for a chariot, but you can just run amok among your opponent's troops and do a lot of damage to infantry. In matchups like the dwarves, this is just a disgustingly powerful unit, and can be a total game changer. Then we do have the Dark Elf Dread Knights. These guys, for me, probably hover around a D to C tier. I'm gonna give them a C, I think, even though that might not necessarily be the most. They're not really used all that often. They have some very good combat stats. They're on paper, they're not a bad unit. They only cost 1250 gold, but they do have one serious issue, and that is once again that terrible HP pool of 4320. And at this point, you're dealing with an elite cav, so there's even more reward for focusing them down. Their stats are not quite that good, but at 1250 gold, they will often get sort of focused down and mulched. And weirdly enough, I think it's actually, and you generally want to bring sort of more of them to really have some more reliability. Whereas I feel like if you bring the Knights of the Ebon Claw, who essentially got a proxy nerf when the Primal Instincts actually got changed, but I actually think they're better. I actually think there's something like a B tier, because if you just want one super elite cav to act as an anchor, normal Dread Knights won't cut the mustard, but the Knights of the Ebon Claw can. Their stats are just that good. They have excellent sustained combat stats. It means that they can be a B tier unit. They can provide you with that single stable cavalry anchor, help anchor your normal Cold One Knights and all those units. Whereas Dread Knights are not good enough for that. And so because of that, Dread Knights make a C tier, definitely leaning towards D maybe even. Genuinely, I can't think of many situations where I'd take these guys over normal Cold One Knights, just because I'd rather save that money, or just get, if I want that elite core cav, I'm going to take the Knights of the Ebon Claw, who I think are a bit better. But I think these guys are C, definitely leaning towards D tier. A bit tough for me. I definitely do run these guys occasionally, so I don't feel that they're that bad, but definitely tough sort of decision there. I did just sort of go completely off script, skip the head with my Regiments of Renown here with Knights of the Ebon Claw, but oh well. We do have the Doomfire Warlocks. These guys, in my opinion, make a C tier as well, not D, C. Overpriced right now, 1,200 gold. Their spells are just not that good. Soulblade's not bad, but the Bound Doombolt is, in my experience, not that good. Perhaps it was fixed in this last patch with supposed buffs to Doombolt, but in my experience, it's just not that strong. These guys are not a terrible combat cav, but it's a 1,200 gold light cav. So if you need to disrupt backlines and overwhelm backlines, you're probably going to bring 2 to 3 Dark Riders or like 2 Harpies rather than bringing 1 unit of Doomfire Warlocks. And if you want to support your cav, the Slunish's Harvesters are a much more potent choice. And these guys, in my opinion, remain in A tier, because for 1,400 gold, you get tier 9 stats. You apply that supporting poison that's normal Doomfire Warlocks would. At the same time, you do have better stats. You have Soul Stealer, which is such a good AoE blob nuke, and you have Word of Pain, which helps you win those cavalry fights. Soulblight isn't bad, but because of how much of the Dark Elf roster is AP to begin with, it's not really that much of a benefit. It's not really that huge of an edge. And yeah, so honestly, the Slunish's Harvesters, easy A tier with these guys, C. Moving on to monsters, Harpies, easy A, probably leaning towards even S tier. They let you make some air power plays, potentially disrupt your opponent's flyers. They've got 44 melee defense, or sorry, 44 weapon strength, 38 melee defense. They can be used to block enemy cav charges, opening up the way for your own cav to get some meaty damage. They can be used to disrupt enemy backlines, to harass units like gyrocopters, either off the map or just keep them running forever. In a very cost-efficient manner. They can disrupt enemy backlines, kill enemy infantry, lower-end sort of backline defense infantry, tie down spears. They're such a versatile unit. I really like Harpies. I feel like there's very few Dark Elf builds where you wouldn't want to bring Harpies. Honestly, they'd border on S tier for me. I'm tempted to give them S tier, but we'll keep them at A because I do think that there is some competition with the Dark Riders there. I do think they're definitely better than Dark Riders most of the time, but they do have somewhat of a different purpose. So I do think that ultimately we'll keep both units up at A tier. Both very strong options though. Then we do have the Manticore. This is going to be an F tier. I know there's people probably already screaming, but you can make it work. Yeah, you can, but it sucks. I hate the Manticore. It's a terrible unit. 45 armor, bad HP, rampages. Yeah. I don't care that you get cheap Fear and Terror. If I want cheap Fear and Terror, I can bring the Sister of the Singing Doom, or I can bring a Summon Manticore with Lore of Beasts. I'm not going to pay for a Manticore to do that. If I want to make air dominance plays, I'm going to do Summon Manticores, Harpies, and Dragons. I'm not going to bother with normal Manticore. Rampage, huge killer, absolutely no bueno. Just very not fond of this unit. I know it can be made to work. I have made it to work myself. I still hate the unit. I don't think it is worth it in most cases. And yeah, unless Rampage gets changed, it's going to be dog crap forever in my opinion. Which does get us on to the Hydra, a unit that is a nice and meaty, in my opinion, C tier. Breath attack, good heals. Okay cost, some decent missile resist, 35%. It's actually very strong missile resist, but combined with low armor. So, all in all, Hydra's definitely a sort of decent monster. It gives you fear, terror, can help your infantry win a fight, can provide a high mass blocking tool, can melt enemy infantry with the breath. Unfortunately, the breath attack is kind of crappy in multiplayer because you can't cast it while you're in melee. And obviously, getting a ground monster with 50 speed out of melee is very difficult. So that was what keeps the Hydra down low, in my opinion. I think if the Hydra, honestly, even despite its kind of low melee defense and whatnot, honestly, if you could launch breath attacks in melee, it could easily be a B or maybe even an A tier monster. But because you can't, it's kind of difficult to actually capitalize on that breath attack, and the rest of the package just isn't that strong. I think usually if you do bring a Hydra, you're going to bring the Chill of Sontar, and we'll get to that one in a little bit. But yeah, normal Hydra, probably a C tier in my book. Charybdis, D tier. And I'm sorry to say, it has one gimmick, and the reason it's not F tier is because it combos so nicely with leadership bombs. You've got Abyssal Roar. So, despite the fact that, yeah, you get poison, but it's not that valuable. You can't regen. The unit doesn't have great leadership. Bonus for charge is nice and all, but your opponent can often cycle charge you with their own monsters because you're so slow. Or cycle charge you with Cav. Low armor means that the unit does trade somewhat poorly with enemy Cav. Especially Cav like, say, Blood Knights or Grail Knights. They'll just destroy it. Very vulnerable to archery fire. And unlike the Hydra, it doesn't have the healing to compensate. No breath attack, so it's not going to be doing crazy damage to enemy infantry. Just a bit of an overpriced unit. But I do think that because of Abyssal Roar, it deserves a D tier just because you've got that utility in leadership bombing. Chill Sontar, B tier. Actually, I should do the Chill Sontar, B tier. Reason being that if you're going to bring your Hydra, you're probably going to bring Chill Sontar. It does have better melee stats and the ability to slow enemies, especially with its Frosty Breath. Not a bad unit. Once again, it's the same issues as the Hydra with breath attacks, but at least it has better melee defense and better sustained combat stats, so it doesn't tend to roll over and die as easily if it gets isolated. Better leadership as well, which tends to be a weakness of the Hydra, is how easily it gets routed. I think it only has 65 leadership, whereas the Chill Sontar has 75, which makes it stick around a good bit longer. Finally, Black Dragon. This guy actually gets C tier. Might come as a surprise, but honestly, usually as Dark Elves, you're not going for Air Force builds, because if you're going to try to wrest the skies from your opponent, well, Dark Elves are too weak to really fight air dominance factions to contest aerial dominance factions for aerial dominance. Something like High Elves, Bretonnia, or Vampire Counts, Vampire Coast, even Lizardmen will beat the snot out of Dark Elves if they decide to dedicate to an air build. So you don't need a bunch of... So you don't really want to do an air build as the Dark Elves, which means that if you're going to bring air, you're probably just going to bring like a Lord on a Dragon against a faction like, say, Beastmen to bully them. Against a faction like, say, Empire, they're probably going to bring like Carl on a Griffin. You don't need a bunch of Lords, or you don't need a bunch of units in the air to wrest aerial control from the Empire. You just need like a Lord and some Harpies, essentially, and that's really all you need. So the Dragon is just overkill against some factions, and completely inadequate against others. So unless you want to do sort of Mimi all air build, which can be very strong against factions that aren't well equipped to deal with it, but unless you want to really focus on the air play, there's very few factions that have a decent air force that Dark Elves can actually try to contest in the skies without hugely crippling themselves. Like, sure, you could try to overwhelm Empire there, but Empire's going to bring guns probably. And if Empire doesn't even commit to the air, they're just going to gun you down and then kick the crap out of you on the ground. If you try to do it with Wood Elves, sure, you can beat the Wood Elves in the air, but what if they brought like 4-way Watchers? Now you're dead. So, just my 2 cents there. It's why this Dragon gets C tier, because I think it's a kind of Mimi unit, even though it's not bad statistically or as an isolated unit. Within the roster, it just doesn't shine that much. And that is it for the Dark Elves. The good old Druki. Hopefully you guys did enjoy the video. If you have your own comments, critiques, your own take on where these units belong, be sure to leave those comments down below. I will do my very best to respond as soon as I can. Obviously, everyone has their own takes on what units perform how, and always good to see what everyone's opinion is. Sometimes I've gotten some great ideas, seen people sort of get great value out of units that I never thought was either possible or thought was very difficult. And it's always good to hear what you guys have to say. So hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you all in the next one. Wyvern out.